she signed the restaurant bill with trembling hands. Each stroke of the pen a conscious choice, not because she needed his permission or financial support, but because she was creating a paper trail of abandonment that would later demonstrate how completely he'd underestimated the pregnant wife he was leaving alone during a family dinner. Before we continue, we want to let you know that you are great and going to be doing great things in 2026. We wish you well in all your endeavors. We love to know how far our story get to touch and heal lives. Kindly share with us where you're watching from in the comment box. Please like this story and click the subscribe button to keep us serving you a heart-healing real stories. Now let's get back. He appeared at the restaurant manager's desk demanding to speak with the owner about inflated charges. His anger focused entirely on money rather than her well-being. Completely unaware that the pregnant wife he abandoned at the restaurant was the secret trillionaire CEO of the company his mother worked for, the same organization that had just made his mother the keynote speaker at their annual leadership conference. His refusal to pay her portion of the bill became a public declaration. His voice rising as he explained to anyone within earshot that she should have thought about restaurant costs before ordering the expensive entree. His words transforming a private crisis into a humiliating spectacle. His family's arrival turned individual cruelty into a collective performance, his mother leading the charge with mockery so cutting that waitstaff intervened to protect their patron's emotional state. Her attacks questioning everything from the pregnancy's legitimacy to her daughter-in-law's intelligence in trapping her son. The family's synchronized assault was devastatingly thorough. While he consulted with lawyers about limiting his obligations, his mother called colleagues to laugh about the disaster my son finally escaped, and his sister posted cryptic social media messages about family betrayals and financial manipulators. None of them comprehending that the woman they were destroying in that restaurant booth was the invisible force who'd approved their mortgages, investments, and the very promotions his mother celebrated as personal achievements. When she walked into the boardroom the next day, her presence causing immediate confusion among executives who'd only known their CEO through encrypted communications and proxy votes. What she did transcended corporate revelation or personal vindication. Her actions made him weep so uncontrollably that security personnel offered him assistance, reduced his mother to begging for another chance with a desperation that shocked colleagues who'd only known her as unshakable, and forced his family to confront that their mockery at the restaurant had been witnessed and documented by the one person whose forgiveness they would desperately need but never receive. Could a husband who'd abandoned his pregnant wife over a restaurant bill ever comprehend that he'd rejected the architect of his family's entire prosperity? Would his mother's corporate reputation survive the revelation that she'd publicly mocked her own CEO during a dinner crisis? And would his family's coordinated cruelty at the restaurant become the catalyst for losing not just relationships, but the financial security they'd assumed was permanent and untouchable? This narrative dissects the intersection of marital betrayal, family cruelty, and corporate power, showing how underestimating people based on circumstances can lead to catastrophic consequences. You will understand the profound importance of treating people with dignity regardless of their apparent vulnerability, and how hidden power can reshape entire narratives when it finally reveals itself. This story provides an unforgettable lesson about respect, accountability, and the reality that the people we dismiss or mistreat often hold far more power than we can imagine, and that cruelty always has consequences. Dear viewers, this story reveals how easily we judge people by their circumstances rather than their character, and the devastating cost of that mistake. You'll discover why treating everyone with dignity matters more than you think, how hidden power can exist where you least expect it, and why cruelty always comes back to haunt those who practice it. What lessons did this story teach you? If you were Felix or Rhoda, what would you have done differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more powerful, entertaining, and life-changing stories that will make you think twice about how you treat others. The upscale restaurant's ambient lighting cast soft shadows across Sophia's face as another wave of nausea seized her body, the morning sickness that had plagued her first trimester having returned with vengeance in her 7th month. She'd arrived at Bellissimo's Italian bistro 3 hours earlier, having deliberately chosen not to call her husband until she was certain this was more than just pregnancy discomfort. The hostess had asked twice about her companion, her professional concern barely masking the judgment in her eyes. When Sophia explained that her husband was on his way, both women understood the hesitation in her voice suggested something more complicated than traffic delays. Felix Carter arrived at 8:47 p.m., his designer suit still crisp from whatever business dinner had apparently taken priority over his wife's third call. His irritation was palpable the moment he stepped through the mahogany doors. He didn't come to their reserved table first. That detail would later seem significant when Sophia reconstructed the evening's events. Instead, he headed directly to the manager's desk, his voice carrying across the dining room as he demanded to speak with someone in charge of preventing customer exploitation. Sophia heard fragments of his tirade from their corner booth: inflated prices, unnecessary extras, and most devastatingly, "I need itemized documentation of every charge because I'm not signing a blank check for someone else's extravagant choices." The restaurant manager, Antonio Ricci, had entered the dining area during Felix's lobby performance, his expression carefully neutral in that way hospitality professionals cultivate when witnessing family dysfunction they cannot ethically address. "Mrs. Carter," Antonio said gently, approaching her table with a glass of sparkling water. "Are you feeling better? Should I call for medical assistance?" Sophia had been experiencing what she thought was severe indigestion, but the cramping had escalated to the point where she could barely sit upright. Her obstetrician, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, had told her to monitor any unusual pain given her gestational diabetes and the baby's breech position. "I just need my husband," Sophia had whispered, though both she and Antonio understood that need was becoming increasingly complicated. Felix appeared at the table during Antonio's check-in, his phone still in his hand, his attention divided between the restaurant situation and whatever text conversation he'd been having. "How much has this evening cost so far?" he'd asked. Not, "How are you feeling?" or, "Is the baby okay?" but a question so transactional that Antonio had actually paused, recalibrating his understanding of the family dynamic he'd walked into. When Antonio explained the bill, $240 for dinner, wine, and the special preparations Sophia had requested to accommodate her dietary restrictions, Felix's response had been swift and devastating. "That's not happening. We'll pay for my meal and water. She can handle her own extravagant choices. Maybe next time she'll think twice before ordering like she's celebrating something." Sophia had pulled out her credit card with hands that shook from both physical pain and emotional shock, her signature appearing on the receipt that Felix refused to even glance at, much less help pay. Antonio, a veteran restaurateur who'd witnessed every variation of family crisis, had quietly waived half the charges and made eye contact with Sophia that communicated both solidarity and professional limitation. "You don't need anyone's permission to take care of yourself," Antonio had said softly, his words carrying a weight that suggested he understood far more than the surface situation revealed. But Felix's financial cruelty was merely the opening act of the evening's degradation. At 9:23 p.m., while Sophia struggled with escalating pain that she now recognized as early contractions, Felix's mother, Rhoda Carter, arrived with the force of a woman who'd received urgent summons about a family emergency. She swept into the restaurant in a Valentino dress despite the late hour, her designer handbag coordinating with shoes that clicked authoritatively against the marble flooring, every element of her appearance broadcasting the corporate power she wielded as Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations at Harrington Global Enterprises, the same company where she'd just been selected as keynote speaker for their annual leadership summit. Rhoda's assessment of the situation was immediate and damning. "This is exactly the kind of manipulative behavior I warned you about," she announced to Felix, her voice loud enough to carry to adjacent tables where other diners couldn't help but overhear. "Suddenly there's a crisis requiring expensive intervention. This is financial entrapment, and I didn't raise you to be anyone's ATM." She turned to Sophia with an expression that mixed contempt with what she probably believed was tough love. "If you cannot afford the consequences of your reproductive choices, perhaps you should have considered that before trying to secure your position in this family through pregnancy." The restaurant manager, Antonio, had actually stepped between Rhoda and Sophia's table at that point, his professional demeanor hardening into something protective and legally precise. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice. This is a fine dining establishment, and your behavior is creating a distressing environment for all our guests." But Rhoda Carter was not a woman accustomed to being corrected by people she perceived as service staff, and her response escalated the confrontation into territory that would later become crucial evidence. "I know my rights and I know manipulation when I see it. This girl has been nothing but a financial drain since my son made the mistake of marrying her, and now she's trying to use a baby and a restaurant scene to lock in her meal ticket." Sophia had endured the verbal assault in silence, each word landing like a physical blow, but her hands never stopped moving. She was documenting everything, timestamps written in the margins of her napkin, names of witnesses noted on the back of her receipt, and most importantly, her phone's voice recorder capturing every word of Rhoda's tirade. She wasn't documenting out of spite or revenge fantasy, but with the calm precision of someone who understood exactly how power worked and how thoroughly these people had misunderstood who held it. By 10 p.m., Felix's sister, Vivian, had joined the restaurant gathering, not to offer support, but to live-stream cryptic messages on her social media about family drama and people who trap men with pregnancies they can't afford. The Carter family had transformed Sophia's medical crisis into their own personal theater of cruelty, performing their contempt with an audience of restaurant patrons, waitstaff and Vivian's 12,000 followers who watched her stories with rapt attention. None of them noticed that Sophia had stopped responding to their provocations, her focus entirely on the contractions, managing her breathing, and the meticulous record she was creating of this night. What none of the Carter family could have known, what they never thought to question despite the incongruities they'd overlooked for 3 years, was that the woman they were publicly humiliating controlled not just her own destiny, but theirs as well. The executive boardroom on the 45th floor of Harrington Global Enterprises headquarters gleamed with the kind of understated luxury that separated billion-dollar corporations from merely successful ones, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city skyline that Rhoda Carter had spent 17 years earning the right to enjoy. The quarterly leadership meeting had been scheduled for 9 a.m., but an emergency addendum had been sent at 6:47 a.m., a message from the CEO's office that read simply, "Mandatory attendance. No exceptions. The CEO will be joining in person for the first time." Rhoda Carter arrived at 8:30 a.m., her confidence bulletproof after the previous night's restaurant confrontation, regaling her fellow executives with an edited version of events that painted her as a protective mother saving her son from financial ruin. "You should have seen her," Rhoda laughed to the chief financial officer and the VP of Human Resources, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequences for such behavior. "Sitting in that restaurant booth like she was entitled to a luxury dining experience on my son's dime. I told Felix he needs to document everything for the divorce attorney because this kind of manipulation is exactly what prenuptial agreements are designed to prevent." The other executives offered uncomfortable laughs and murmured agreements, not because they necessarily endorsed Rhoda's viciousness, but because Rhoda Carter was not a woman whose displeasure anyone courted voluntarily. She'd built her reputation on ruthless efficiency and her ability to handle difficult personnel situations, which was corporate euphemism for her willingness to destroy careers when she perceived disloyalty or incompetence. Her impending keynote speech at the leadership conference was meant to celebrate her decisive leadership style, though the HR department had received 19 complaints about her management approach in the past 4 years alone, complaints that somehow never reached the CEO's attention. At 8:55 a.m., the boardroom began filling with Harrington Global's entire executive leadership team, 25 vice presidents, 8 C-suite officers, and the company's general counsel, who always attended meetings where the CEO might make rare appearances. They'd been briefed that the CEO would be addressing organizational restructuring and accountability measures, language vague enough to make everyone nervous, but specific enough to ensure complete attendance. Rhoda had secured her usual seat near the head of the table, her leather portfolio open to notes for the quarterly performance review she'd prepared, completely unconcerned about whatever restructuring might be announced. Her numbers were excellent, her department ran efficiently, and she'd just successfully navigated a family crisis that proved her ability to handle pressure. The boardroom doors opened at exactly 9 a.m., but instead of the elderly male CEO that many executives had imagined, their mysterious leader who'd only ever appeared via encrypted video calls and proxy votes, a young woman entered. She was visibly pregnant, moving with the careful deliberation of someone in physical discomfort, wearing a tailored maternity dress that was elegant but noticeably less expensive than the designer suits surrounding her. Several executives glanced at her with confusion, assuming she was perhaps an assistant who'd been sent to announce another delay. But the company's general counsel, Richard Morrison, stood immediately, his expression mixing shock with something that looked like vindication. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice cutting through the confused murmuring, "I'd like to introduce the founder and CEO of Harrington Global Enterprises, Sophia Harrington." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. 25 vice presidents and 8 C-suite officers experienced simultaneous cognitive recalibration as they processed the impossible information. The mysterious CEO who'd built a trillion-dollar enterprise through brilliant acquisitions and market predictions was not the seasoned businessman they'd imagined, but a 29-year-old woman who looked like she'd just come from a difficult night. Rhoda Carter's face drained of all color, her confident posture collapsing as her brain struggled to reconcile the manipulative gold digger from last night's restaurant with the woman who controlled her career, her salary, her mortgage approval, and her upcoming keynote speech invitation. Sophia moved to the head of the conference table with quiet authority, her physical discomfort evident but her presence commanding in ways that had nothing to do with volume or aggression. She placed a tablet on the table, not the leather portfolio of someone performing executive cosplay, but the actual device from which she'd managed a global empire while her husband and his family assumed she was unemployed. "I apologize for the dramatic revelation," Sophia began, her voice steady despite the obvious pain she was managing. "But recent events have made it necessary to address some fundamental issues about respect, accountability, and the culture we're building at this organization." Richard Morrison activated the Boardroom's presentation screen, and footage began playing. Audio recordings and timestamp videos from the previous night's restaurant incident, complete with transcripts that appeared alongside the recordings. Rhoda Carter's voice filled the boardroom. "This girl has been nothing but a financial drain since my son made the mistake of marrying her, and now she's trying to use a baby and a restaurant scene to lock in her meal ticket." The words that had seemed powerful in a restaurant booth at 10 p.m. sounded monstrous when played back in the corporate setting where Rhoda had built her reputation on professional excellence. But Sophia didn't stop with the restaurant recordings. The presentation continued with documented evidence of Rhoda's management style, the 19 HR complaints that had mysteriously never reached the CEO, emails in which Rhoda had mocked subordinates, emotional weaknesses, and most damning, communications showing that Rhoda had blocked 5 separate diversity initiatives because they would lower standards in her department. Every executive in the room watched their colleague's true character emerge from behind the veneer of professional competence, and several looked physically ill as they realized they'd laughed along with her cruel stories about her daughter-in-law less than 30 minutes earlier. "Rhoda Carter," Sophia said quietly, her voice carrying more authority than any amount of shouting could have achieved, "you are terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct, harassment, and violation of our company's core values. Your keynote speech is cancelled. Your severance package, which would have been substantial given your years of service, has been reduced to the legal minimum due to the severity of your behavior. You have 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings under security escort." Rhoda's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her legendary composure shattered so completely that she looked like a different person. "Sophia, please," she finally managed, her voice cracking with desperation that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. "I didn't know. I never would have. You have to understand, I thought you were. You thought I was powerless," Sophia finished for her, each word precise and devastating. "You thought my value as a human being was determined by my financial dependence on your son. You thought pregnancy made me vulnerable rather than worthy of protection. And most tellingly, you thought cruelty was an acceptable response to perceived weakness." She paused, letting the words settle over the room like a judgment that extended beyond Rhoda to everyone who'd enabled her behavior. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character and your fitness for leadership in this organization." Security personnel appeared at the boardroom doors, not because Rhoda posed a physical threat, but because her breakdown had progressed to the point where professional intervention seemed prudent. She was escorted toward the exit, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like a shield, when she turned back with one final desperate plea. "What about Felix? What about your marriage? You can't destroy our entire family over one mistake." Sophia's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes communicated a finality that made Rhoda's words die in her throat. "Your son abandoned his pregnant wife at a restaurant because paying for her dinner was too expensive. He consulted with divorce attorneys while I was experiencing contractions. He refused to help with a $200 bill despite my high-risk pregnancy status." She glanced down at the tablet that contained 3 years of documented evidence. "But those weren't mistakes, Mrs. Carter. Those were choices that revealed exactly who he is. Just as your behavior last night revealed who you are." The boardroom door closed behind Rhoda Carter, and the remaining executives sat in stunned silence, each processing their own proximity to the catastrophe they'd just witnessed. Several were mentally reviewing their own interactions with Rhoda, wondering if they'd been complicit in creating the environment that had allowed her cruelty to flourish. Others were recalculating their understanding of the quiet young woman some had seen at company events, always standing slightly apart from the crowd, always observing but never seeking attention. Sophia remained standing at the head of the table, her hand resting protectively on her abdomen where her baby, the child Felix had considered too expensive to support, moved with the restless energy of late pregnancy. "The reason I've chosen to reveal my identity today," she continued, her voice addressing the broader implications beyond one woman's termination, "is because Rhoda Carter's behavior represents a systemic failure that extends throughout this organization. She didn't create her cruelty in a vacuum. She learned that it was acceptable, even advantageous, because we've built a culture where results excuse behavior and power excuses contempt. The executives shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Sophia's critique extended beyond the departed Rhoda to the leadership structure that had enabled and rewarded her approach for over a decade. Effective immediately, Sophia announced, we will be implementing comprehensive accountability measures for all leadership positions. The HR complaints that were lost or misfiled will be reviewed by an external firm. The diversity initiatives that were blocked will be reinstated and expanded. And most importantly, we will be establishing clear consequences for behavior that degrades, dismisses, or dehumanizes anyone in this organization, regardless of their position or perceived vulnerability. Richard Morrison was distributing folders to each executive, documents that outlined the new accountability framework with the kind of legal precision that suggested months of preparation rather than overnight reaction. Sophia had been planning this transformation long before the restaurant incident. The previous night had simply provided the catalyst that made revelation strategically advantageous rather than unnecessarily disruptive. I built this company from nothing, Sophia said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone stating simple facts rather than boasting. I did it while pretending to be unemployed because I wanted to see who people truly were when they thought I had no power to affect their lives. Some of you treated me with basic human decency at company events. Others ignored me or made assumptions about my intelligence and worth. Those observations have informed every promotion decision, every department allocation, and every strategic choice I've made. She paused, making eye contact with several executives who suddenly looked pale. Moving forward, you will be evaluated not just on your results, but on how you achieve them and who you become in the process of pursuing success. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, but the fundamental power structure of Harrington Global Enterprises had been permanently altered in the first 15. Sophia Harrington was no longer the mysterious voice on encrypted calls, but a visible leader whose pregnancy and youth didn't diminish her authority but rather amplified the courage required to build an empire while being systematically underestimated. As executives filed out of the boardroom, their expressions ranged from chastened to terrified to genuinely inspired. Sophia remained at the windows overlooking the city, her hand on the glass, feeling the vibration of the building beneath her palm. Her building. Her company. Her vision that had been forged in the fires of being dismissed and underestimated. The baby kicked against her ribs, a reminder that some forms of power couldn't be hidden in corporate structures or encrypted communications but demanded to be acknowledged regardless of convenience or cost. Somewhere in the building below, Rhoda Carter was being escorted through a lobby she'd walked through with arrogant confidence for 17 years, carrying a box of personal belongings that represented the sudden collapse of everything she'd built on a foundation of cruelty disguised as strength. And in a law office across the city, Felix Carter was about to receive a phone call that would shatter his understanding of the marriage he'd thought he was escaping. Felix Carter sat in the law offices of Morrison & Associates at 10:15 a.m., his confidence bolstered by his mother's assurances that good attorneys can protect you from gold diggers who use pregnancy as leverage. He'd chosen James Morrison specifically because the attorney had a reputation for aggressive divorce strategies that prioritized asset protection over emotional considerations, exactly the approach Felix believed his situation required. The consultation had been scheduled for 3 weeks, arranged shortly after Sophia's pregnancy announcement had transformed what Felix considered a temporary marriage into something that threatened his financial future and personal freedom. The key, James Morrison was explaining, his silver hair and expensive suit projecting the authority of 4 decades practicing family law, is documenting a pattern of financial irresponsibility and unreasonable demands. The restaurant incident you described last night is perfect. Demanding expensive meals, refusing to consider cost-effective alternatives, creating scenes that conveniently require your financial rescue. He slid a legal pad across his mahogany desk, the notes already outlining a strategy that painted Sophia as manipulative and Felix as a victim of reproductive coercion. Felix nodded enthusiastically, his relief palpable as the attorney validated every justification he'd constructed for his behavior. Exactly. And my mother witnessed the whole thing. She can testify that Sophia was being completely unreasonable about the dinner costs. She ordered the most expensive entree on the menu, knowing I'd have to pay for it. The revision of history was seamless, Felix's brain having already rewritten the previous night's events into a narrative where he was the responsible party making difficult but necessary decisions. James's assistant knocked on the office door at 10:23 a.m., her expression apologetic for the interruption but urgent enough to suggest something requiring immediate attention. "Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry, but you have an emergency call on line 4. The caller says it's regarding the Carter consultation and it cannot wait. James frowned. He didn't appreciate interruptions during billable hours, but something in his assistant's tone suggested this wasn't a standard call that could be deferred to voicemail. He picked up the phone with visible irritation, his greeting professional but clipped. James Morrison speaking. The voice on the other end made his expression transform from annoyance to confusion to something approaching horror in the span of 20 seconds. Felix watched the attorney's face drain of color, his confident posture collapsing as he listened to information that was clearly devastating. "I understand," James finally said, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. "Yes, I will inform my client immediately. No, there will be absolutely no further action on this matter. You have my word." James placed the phone down with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain composure while their professional world crumbled, and he looked at Felix with an expression that mixed pity with barely concealed anger at having been made complicit in something catastrophic. "Mr. Carter," he began, each word measured and careful, "I need to inform you that I cannot represent you in divorce proceedings against Sophia Harrington. In fact, no reputable attorney in this city will be able to represent you, and I strongly advise you to retain legal counsel immediately, not for divorce but for the consequences you're about to face." Felix's confusion was genuine and complete. "What are you talking about? Who was that on the phone? Sophia doesn't even have an attorney. She can't afford one, which is exactly why I need protection." The words died as James activated his computer screen and turned it to face Felix, displaying the Harrington Global Enterprises website with its corporate leadership page that Felix had never thought to examine during his 3-year marriage. The photograph showed Sophia. His Sophia, the woman he'd assumed was unemployed and financially dependent, identified as Sophia Harrington, founder and chief executive officer. The bio beneath detailed her creation of a $1 trillion enterprise through strategic acquisitions in technology, pharmaceutical development, and sustainable energy sectors, her Stanford MBA that she'd completed while building her company, and her reputation as one of the most brilliant and secretive minds in modern business. Felix's brain struggled to process the information, each fact colliding with his constructed reality where Sophia was the helpless party and he was the one with power. "That phone call," James continued, his professional detachment barely masking his fury at having been used in what could have become a career-ending ethical violation, "was from Harrington Global's general counsel, informing me that your wife, your extraordinarily wealthy and powerful wife, has comprehensive documentation of your behavior, including last night's restaurant abandonment. They wanted to ensure I understood the legal and professional consequences of proceeding with a divorce strategy based on fictitious claims of her financial manipulation." The attorney opened a folder that his assistant had apparently delivered during the phone call, documents that Felix recognized with growing horror as his own financial records. Mortgage applications, car loans, credit card accounts, investment portfolios, every single one approved or facilitated by Harrington Global's Financial Services Division. "Your mother's position at Harrington Global," James continued, his tone suggesting he was delivering information Felix should have discovered through basic due diligence. "Your sister's marketing contract with their subsidiary. Your father's retirement investment portfolio managed by their wealth management division. Your own business loan that allowed you to open that consulting firm 2 years ago." He paused, letting each revelation land like a physical blow. "All of it flows from your wife's company. You didn't build your life despite her. You built it entirely because of her." Felix's hands were shaking as he scrolled through the corporate documentation, finding his own name attached to transactions he'd celebrated as personal achievements, the business loan he'd secured through excellent networking, the mortgage approval that had come through because of my strong credit, the investment opportunities his father had bragged about discovering through superior market research. Every advantage the Carter family had celebrated as proof of their superiority had originated from the woman they'd spent 3 years dismissing as beneath them. "The restaurant bill you refused to pay," James's voice had shifted from angry to something approaching clinical assessment of catastrophic failure, "approximately $240 for a dinner where your pregnant wife was experiencing complications. Your wife's personal net worth is conservatively estimated at $2.8 billion. You abandoned the mother of your child, a woman who could have bought the entire restaurant chain, over a bill that represents 0.000086% of her wealth because you assumed her vulnerability made her worthless." The law office suddenly felt suffocating, the leather chairs and mahogany furniture transforming from symbols of power into witnesses to Felix's complete misjudgment of reality. His phone began buzzing with incoming calls and texts, the volume suggesting something significant had happened in the world beyond this office. He glanced at the screen to see messages from his mother, his sister, former colleagues, and business associates, the preview texts visible enough to communicate catastrophe. What did you do? And did you know who she was? And your mother just got fired, and the company is saying you abandoned the CEO. James stood, signaling the consultation's termination with body language that communicated both professional obligation and personal disgust. Mr. Carter, I'm going to give you advice that I rarely offer because it typically falls on deaf ears. You need to understand that you didn't just destroy your marriage or make a mistake in judgment. You revealed your fundamental character to someone with comprehensive power over your entire family's financial ecosystem. And you did it in the most cruel and public way imaginable. He walked to his office door, opening it in clear invitation for Felix to leave. The question isn't whether you can win a divorce settlement. The question is whether you can convince your wife not to dismantle everything your family has built on the foundation of her generosity that you mistook for weakness. Felix walked through the law office lobby in a daze, other clients and attorneys glancing at him with expressions suggesting they'd already heard rumors about the Carter consultation disaster. His phone continued its relentless buzzing, a call from his mother that he couldn't bring himself to answer, knowing that her legendary confidence had just been shattered in a boardroom 45 floors above the city. He stepped onto the street where morning traffic continued its indifferent flow, the world operating normally while his entire understanding of his place in it collapsed. A text message appeared from an unknown number, the content brief and devastating. Felix, this is Richard Morrison, General Counsel for Harrington Global Enterprises. Sophia has requested that I inform you she will be staying at the corporate residence for the foreseeable future. Your personal belongings from the marital home will be delivered to your parents' address. She will be in contact through legal counsel regarding custody arrangements and property division. I strongly advise you to retain an attorney who specializes in family law, though I should note that Sophia has indicated her intention to be fair in the settlement despite your behavior. That generosity is more than you deserve. Felix stood on the sidewalk reading and rereading the message, his brain still struggling to reconcile the woman who would offer a fair settlement with the woman he'd abandoned at a restaurant 12 hours earlier. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Sophia was simultaneously the powerless victim he'd discarded and the most powerful person he'd ever known, and his inability to see both truths simultaneously had cost him everything. A fair settlement from a billionaire would still leave him comfortable. But he'd traded a marriage to the most remarkable woman he'd ever met for the privilege of cruelty he believed came without consequences. His sister Vivian's social media posts from the previous night were already being screen-capped and shared across platforms, her cryptic messages about family betrayals and financial manipulators now recontextualized as the Carter family publicly mocking a pregnant billionaire during a medical emergency. The comments sections filled with outrage, disbelief, and the particular brand of internet justice that destroys reputations with viral efficiency. Within hours, Felix Carter would be trending, not as a successful consultant, but as the man too foolish to recognize his own wife's worth. But the most devastating realization came as Felix stood outside the law office, watching the city move around him. Sophia had known. She'd known for their entire marriage that she had the power to expose him, to punish him, to destroy his family's financial foundation with a single decision. And she'd chosen not to use that power. She'd attended company parties where his mother worked, standing quietly in corners while Rhoda Carter mocked her to colleagues, and she'd never revealed that she controlled Rhoda's career. She'd lived in modest apartments and driven practical cars and never corrected his assumptions about her financial dependence, not because she was hiding something shameful, but because she'd been testing whether he could love her without the corruption of knowing her wealth. He had failed that test so completely that the failure would define the rest of his life. A black car pulled up to the curb and Felix recognized the Harrington Global logo on the door. The driver emerged with a manila envelope, his expression professionally neutral, as he handed it to Felix without comment before returning to the vehicle and driving away. Inside the envelope were divorce papers, already filed and processed with the efficiency that unlimited resources could purchase, and a handwritten note in Sophia's careful script. Felix, I gave you every opportunity to see me as a person rather than a circumstance. I hoped that love might be stronger than the corruption of knowing my wealth, but I learned that you couldn't respect someone you perceived as powerless. The cruelty you showed last night wasn't an aberration but a revelation of who you become when you think there are no consequences for your actions. I'm filing for divorce not because you abandoned me at the restaurant, but because you proved that your values are conditional on whether someone can defend themselves from your contempt. Our child deserves a father who understands that human worth isn't measured in financial utility. I hope you become that person even if it's too late for us. Sophia. Felix read the note 3 times, each word a precise articulation of his failure. And for the first time since the restaurant, tears began streaming down his face. Not tears of self-pity or anger, but the devastating recognition that he'd destroyed something irreplaceable because he'd been too arrogant to imagine he could be wrong about someone's value. The security personnel James Morrison had mentioned weren't coming to arrest him. There was no legal crime in abandoning your wife at a restaurant or refusing to pay for her dinner when she didn't need your money. The consequences were far more profound than legal punishment. He would live the rest of his life knowing he'd been married to an extraordinary woman and had treated her with casual cruelty because he'd mistaken her discretion for weakness. Somewhere in a corporate residence 45 floors above the city, Sophia Harrington was preparing for the birth of a child who would inherit a trillion-dollar empire and a mother who'd proven that power wielded with integrity was far more devastating than any amount of revenge. And Felix Carter stood on a sidewalk holding divorce papers, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost, knowing that no amount of weeping or begging for another chance could undo the choice he'd made when he'd valued money over the human being carrying his child. 3 weeks after the Boardroom revelation, Sophia Harrington sat in her private office on the 45th floor, her daughter sleeping peacefully in a bassinet beside her desk, a detail that would have scandalized traditional corporate culture but was precisely the kind of boundary-breaking Sophia had built her company to enable. Little Isabella Grace Harrington had arrived via scheduled C-section 2 days after the divorce papers were filed, delivered by the same medical team at Metropolitan General Hospital who'd been contacted after the restaurant incident, their exceptional care motivated not by Sophia's wealth but by their commitment to ensuring no patient experienced preventable complications. The view from Sophia's office encompassed the city where she'd built an empire while being systematically underestimated, each building in the skyline representing a choice she'd made to value substance over appearance, results over recognition. Her assistant knocked softly before entering, carrying the afternoon's priority correspondence that required Sophia's personal attention rather than executive delegation. Among the standard contracts and strategic proposals was a handwritten letter on expensive stationery, the return address indicating it came from Felix Carter. Sophia had received 52 communications from Felix since the divorce filing, texts that progressed from confused to angry to desperate to genuinely remorseful, voicemails that captured his psychological journey from denial to acceptance, and 4 previous letters that her attorneys had screened and summarized without requiring her direct engagement. "This letter is different," her assistant explained quietly, "because it doesn't ask for anything. It doesn't beg for another chance or request reconsideration or attempt to negotiate the divorce settlement." Sophia opened the letter while Isabella slept, the afternoon light casting shadows across handwriting that looked less controlled than Felix's usual precise script, suggesting he'd written it in genuine emotional turmoil rather than calculated strategy. "Sophia, I've started this letter 67 times over the past 3 weeks. And every version felt inadequate because there aren't words that can communicate the magnitude of my failure or the depth of my regret. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness because I understand that what I did was unforgivable. I'm writing because you deserve to know the truth about who I was before you married me, and I owe you the truth about who I've become since you left. I didn't abandon you at the restaurant because I couldn't afford your dinner bill. I abandoned you because I'd constructed an entire identity around being the successful partner in our marriage, and your pregnancy threatened that delusion. When you were vulnerable, when you needed me most, I saw an opportunity to assert power I thought I deserved and I took it. That's the truth that's harder to face than simple cruelty or financial anxiety. I chose to be cruel because it made me feel important. My mother called me yesterday from the apartment she's renting with the severance package your company provided, the legal minimum that's still more generous than most people receive for decades of service. She wanted to strategize about how we could fight back against what you did to our family. I told her the truth I should have told her 3 years ago. We didn't lose anything that was actually ours. Every advantage we celebrated, every opportunity we claimed through merit, every success we attributed to our superiority came from your generosity that we mistook for weakness. We weren't victims of your revelation. We were beneficiaries of your patience, and we responded to your kindness with contempt. I've been seeing a therapist. Not the kind who helps you win custody battles, but the kind who forces you to confront why you became someone capable of abandoning their pregnant wife over a restaurant bill. We've talked about how I learned to measure people's worth by their utility to me, how I confused financial dependence with personal weakness, how I developed a worldview where vulnerability was contemptible rather than human. Those conversations have been more painful than losing you because they've shown me that I didn't just fail in one moment. I built an entire personality around values that are fundamentally broken. Isabella is 3 weeks old now, and I've seen exactly 4 photographs that your attorney sent to establish that I'm being kept informed of her well-being. She has your eyes and my grandmother's chin and an expression of serious concentration that makes her look like she's already planning her first corporate acquisition. I know I have no right to be part of her life beyond whatever custody arrangement you deem appropriate, but I want you to know that I'm working to become someone worthy of being her father, even if that transformation comes too late to save our marriage. The settlement you offered is more than fair. It's more than I deserve. And the fact that you can be generous after what I did to you tells me everything I need to know about the difference between who you are and who I became. I'm not contesting anything. I'm signing the papers and accepting the consequences of my choices, not because I've given up, but because I finally understand that love isn't about what I can take from someone, but what I can become for them. I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect it to change anything between us. I'm writing because you spent 3 years being invisible in our marriage, and I want you to know that I finally see you. Not your wealth or your power or your corporate achievements, but the woman who gave me every opportunity to be better than I was, and who documented my failure not out of vindictiveness but out of a realistic assessment that I would never voluntarily accept responsibility for my cruelty. I hope Isabella grows up to have your integrity, your patience, and your ability to see through people's performances to their actual character. And I hope she never meets someone like who I was when I walked away from you in that restaurant. I'm sorry. Those words are inadequate, but they're the truth I should have been capable of recognizing 3 weeks ago. Felix. Sophia read the letter twice, her professional mind analyzing it for manipulation or strategy while her exhausted heart recognized what seemed like genuine transformation, though she'd learned through brutal experience that people's capacity for performance often exceeded their capacity for actual change. She placed the letter in a folder marked Personal, Isabella's Future, a collection of documents she was assembling so her daughter would someday understand the complicated circumstances of her birth and the choices her mother had made in responding to betrayal. The intercom on Sophia's desk chimed softly, her assistant's voice conveying information that required immediate attention. Ms. Harrington, the reporter from Fortune magazine, is here for your interview about the restructuring at Harrington Global, and the Diversity Initiative team has the quarterly report ready for your review. Should I have them wait until after the Fortune interview? Sophia glanced at Isabella, still sleeping peacefully despite the corporate machinery operating around her, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks earlier. Send the diversity team in first. The Fortune interview can wait 30 minutes. They're here to write about corporate accountability, and I'd rather show them what that looks like in practice than just talk about it in theory. She stood, smoothing her dress and checking her reflection, not out of vanity but out of awareness that every choice she made now would be scrutinized as evidence of whether powerful women could balance motherhood and corporate leadership. The Diversity Initiative team entered her office with visible nervousness. 4 junior executives who'd been promoted specifically because Sophia's restructuring had eliminated the gatekeepers like Rhoda Carter who'd blocked their advancement for years. They'd prepared a presentation about recruiting practices, mentorship programs and accountability metrics, but their eyes kept darting to the bassinet where Isabella slept, clearly uncertain about the protocol for presenting to a CEO with an infant in the room. Before we begin, Sophia said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had built a trillion-dollar empire, I want you to understand why this meeting is happening in this office with my daughter present. For too long, we've operated under the delusion that professional excellence requires separating our humanity from our work. We've built systems that punish vulnerability and reward people who can perform in vulnerability most convincingly. That paradigm doesn't just harm individuals, it corrupts our entire understanding of what leadership should look like. She gestured to the presentation materials they'd brought, inviting them to proceed while she listened with the same focused attention she gave to billion-dollar acquisition strategies. Their proposals were thoughtful and comprehensive, addressing not just surface-level diversity metrics but the deeper cultural issues that had allowed people like Rhoda Carter to thrive while talented people were systematically excluded. As they presented, Isabella began to fuss softly, and Sophia picked her up without interrupting the presentation, holding her daughter while processing complex policy proposals with the kind of integrated competence that shouldn't have been remarkable but was still sufficiently rare to be revolutionary. The Fortune reporter, admitted to the office 25 minutes later, captured an image that would become iconic in discussions about modern leadership. Sophia Harrington nursing her infant daughter while signing off on a diversity initiative that would reshape hiring practices across a trillion-dollar enterprise. The photograph wasn't staged or calculated for publicity. It was simply the reality of a woman who refused to accept that power and humanity were mutually exclusive categories. "Ms. Harrington," the reporter began, her recorder activated and her questions prepared through weeks of research. "3 weeks ago, you revealed your identity as CEO in what many are calling the most dramatic boardroom confrontation in corporate history. You fired a senior vice president, restructured your entire leadership accountability framework, and filed for divorce from your husband who'd abandoned you during a pregnancy complication at a restaurant. Some are calling you a hero. Others are suggesting this was a calculated revenge plot. How do you respond to those characterizations?" Sophia adjusted Isabella's position, her daughter's small hand gripping her finger with the kind of trust that Felix's letter claimed he was working to deserve. "I respond by rejecting the premise that those are the only two options. I'm not a hero. I'm a person who had access to power and chose to use it to address injustice rather than perpetuate it. And this wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been using my power to destroy people who hurt me. What I did was create accountability for behavior that should never have been acceptable in the first place." The reporter scribbled notes, her follow-up question already forming. "But surely there's a personal element to this. Your former mother-in-law mocked you publicly. Your husband abandoned you at a restaurant, and within days you'd fired her and filed for divorce. That timing suggests emotional motivation rather than pure policy implementation." Sophia smiled slightly, recognizing the attempt to reduce her choices to emotional reaction rather than strategic decision-making. "Here's what I want people to understand. Rhoda Carter wasn't fired because she was cruel to me personally. She was fired because her cruelty to me revealed a pattern of behavior that had been harming this organization for over a decade. Those 19 HR complaints that never reached my attention, those diversity initiatives that were mysteriously blocked, those talented employees who left because they couldn't survive in her department. All of that predated her restaurant behavior. I just hadn't connected the dots because I was operating through intermediaries rather than direct observation." She paused, letting Isabella settle into sleep against her shoulder, the weight of her daughter grounding the conversation in stakes beyond corporate policy. "The personal element isn't that I fired someone who hurt me. The personal element is that being underestimated gave me perspective I wouldn't have had if everyone had known my identity from the beginning. I saw how people treat those they perceive as powerless, and that observation informed every restructuring decision I've made." The interview continued for 90 minutes, ranging from questions about Harrington Global's diversity initiatives to Sophia's plans for parental leave policies to her perspective on whether women leaders face different scrutiny than their male counterparts. Through it all, Isabella slept or nursed or made the small noises of infancy, her presence transforming what could have been a standard corporate profile into something more nuanced, an examination of what leadership looked like when it refused to pretend that power required performing in vulnerability. As the reporter prepared to leave, she asked one final question that cut to the heart of the narrative that had captivated public attention. "Your ex-husband's letter has been reported in several outlets. Apparently someone from the law office leaked details about his remorse and his therapy and his acceptance of the divorce settlement. Do you believe people can change? Do you think his transformation is genuine?" Sophia walked to the window, looking out over the city where Felix was presumably rebuilding his understanding of himself and his values. "I believe people can change," she said carefully, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood how her answer would be quoted and analyzed. "I also believe that change is most meaningful when it happens because someone recognizes their behavior was wrong, not because they got caught or lost something valuable. Felix is devastated, but I don't know yet whether he's devastated because he hurt me or because he lost access to what I could provide him. That distinction matters." She turned back to the reporter, Isabella still sleeping against her shoulder, the visual embodiment of stakes that extended beyond corporate restructuring or personal vindication. "What I do know is that our daughter deserves a father who treats people with dignity regardless of whether they have power to affect his life. If Felix becomes that person, truly becomes that person through years of genuine work rather than months of performative regret, then Isabella will benefit from having him in her life. But I'm not interested in giving him another chance to prove he can love me when I'm visibly powerful. I already know he can do that. What I needed him to prove was that he could love me when he thought I was powerless, and he failed that test catastrophically." She paused, the weight of her next words evident in her expression. "People ask me if I regret hiding my identity for 3 years, if I regret marrying someone who didn't know who I really was. But here's what they don't understand. Felix knew exactly who I was. He knew I was intelligent, capable, observant, and caring. What he didn't know was that I had money and power. The fact that knowing those two additional facts would have completely changed how he treated me tells you everything you need to know about his values and nothing you need to know about mine. I didn't hide my true self. I just removed the variables that corrupt people's ability to see clearly. 6 months after the Boardroom revelation, Sophia established the Carter Foundation, a name that made her attorneys wince but that Sophia insisted was necessary. The foundation focused on supporting pregnant women experiencing financial abuse, providing legal resources, medical advocacy, and economic support for people escaping relationships where their vulnerability was weaponized. The foundation's first major grant went to hospitality workers who witnessed family abuse in restaurants, funding a training program that helped staff recognize signs of financial abuse during family meals and connect patrons with resources before crisis escalated to abandonment. Felix attended the foundation's launch event, sitting in the back row where he could witness the transformation of his cruelty into systemic support for others, his presence neither welcomed nor rejected but simply acknowledged as part of the complicated truth about how harm could eventually catalyze healing. He'd been seeing Isabella every other weekend under a custody arrangement Sophia had structured to prioritize their daughter's well-being over Felix's punishment, and the supervised visits had shown him a child who would grow up knowing her worth wasn't conditional on anyone's perception of her utility. The Carter Foundation's mission statement, written by Sophia and displayed prominently at the launch event, captured the lessons she'd learned through her restaurant abandonment and boardroom revelation. Human worth is not determined by financial independence, social power, or the ability to defend oneself from cruelty. Every person deserves dignity, respect, and support, especially in moments of vulnerability. This foundation exists because one woman had the resources to protect herself from abandonment, and we believe everyone deserves that protection regardless of their wealth. We transform stories of individual harm into systemic change because the appropriate response to injustice isn't just personal recovery, it's ensuring that others don't face the same cruelty we survived. As Sophia stood at the podium with Isabella, now 6 months old, balanced on her hip, she looked out over an audience that included former employees who'd left Harrington Global under Rhoda Carter's leadership, restaurant workers who'd witnessed the incident, and reporters who'd followed the story from boardroom revelation to foundation launch. I want to thank my former husband for teaching me the most valuable lesson I've learned in building a trillion-dollar enterprise, she said, her voice carrying both genuine gratitude and subtle irony. He showed me that the true measure of someone's character isn't how they treat people who can affect their success, but how they treat people they believe cannot defend themselves. That lesson has informed every hiring decision, every policy change, and every strategic choice I've made in restructuring this company. Felix sat in the back row, tears streaming down his face, not the performative weeping of someone seeking sympathy, but the quiet devastation of someone confronting the permanent consequences of temporary choices. His therapy had helped him understand that Sophia wasn't obligated to forgive him, that Isabella wasn't a vehicle for rebuilding his relationship with her mother, and that genuine change meant accepting that some damage couldn't be repaired, no matter how sincerely he regretted causing it. The foundation would go on to help thousands of people experiencing financial abuse during pregnancy, its resources preventing abandonments and providing alternatives for people trapped in relationships where their vulnerability was exploited. And every person helped by the Carter Foundation would benefit from a billionaire's choice to transform personal betrayal into systemic support, to use power not for revenge but for preventing others from experiencing the cruelty she'd survived. Sophia Harrington built her empire while being underestimated. And when she finally revealed herself, she chose accountability over destruction, transformation over revenge, and systematic change over personal vindication. She proved that the most powerful response to cruelty wasn't matching it with equal cruelty, but creating a world where such behavior had consequences and where vulnerability was protected rather than exploited. And Isabella Grace Harrington would grow up in that world, learning from her mother's example that true power lies not in dominating others but in using whatever advantages you possess to ensure that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, is treated with the dignity that all humans deserve. The lesson was simple but revolutionary. Treat people with respect, not because you know their power, but because recognizing their humanity is the only measure of your own character that ultimately matters.